helicopters cutting through the night sky, convoys moving through narrow streets, prison walls reinforced with concrete, steel, and armed guards, built to hold the most dangerous criminals in the world, and yet twice they failed. For more than 3 decades, Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera remained one of the most elusive figures in international law enforcement. His name appeared in intelligence briefings, court documents, and headlines across continents. Not because he acted alone, and not because he was unstoppable, but because he understood how to operate within systems that were fragmented, underfunded, and deeply compromised. Known globally as El Chapo, Guzmán became a central figure to major cities in the United States, Europe, and beyond. At its height, the organization he helped lead was moving enormous quantities of illegal drugs across borders, generating billions of dollars in revenue each year. But the story of El Chapo is not simply the story of a criminal mastermind. It is a story shaped by geography, poverty, corruption, and demand. A story about how organized crime adapts faster than institutions designed to stop it. And a story that forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility, not just of individuals, but of governments and societies. For years, Guzmán avoided capture through a combination of mobility, loyalty, and information control. He changed locations frequently, limited his use of technology, and relied on networks of protection that extended far beyond armed guards. In many regions, he operated in plain sight, shielded not only by fear, but by cooperation, voluntary or coerced. His arrests, escapes, and eventual conviction would become symbols of both progress and failure. Each capture was presented as a turning point. Each escape revealed how fragile that progress truly was. This documentary does not attempt to mythologize Joaquín Guzmán. It does not portray him as a folk hero, nor as a singular force of evil. Instead, it examines how he rose, how he maintained power for so long, and why his removal did not bring the end many expected. By tracing his life and operations, we begin to see a larger picture, one where individuals are interchangeable, but systems endure. Understanding El Chapo means understanding the conditions that allowed him to exist, and those conditions are still very much alive. Guzmán's childhood was shaped by isolation. La Tuna was not simply poor, it was disconnected. Roads were unreliable, medical care was limited, and government presence was minimal. For many residents, the state existed only as an abstract idea, not a daily reality. In this environment, loyalty mattered more than law. Authority came from family ties, reputation, and the ability to provide protection or income. Children grew up understanding that survival required adaptability, not obedience. Drug cultivation had existed in the region for decades. Long before Guzmán was born, poppy and marijuana fields were hidden in mountainous terrain that made enforcement difficult. For families with few alternatives, participation was normalized. Guzmán's early exposure to this economy gave him practical knowledge rather than ideology. He learned how crops were grown, how goods were transported, and how silence was enforced. These lessons were informal, passed down through observation rather than instruction. By his late teens, Guzmán had developed a reputation for reliability. He was not known for recklessness or public displays of violence. Instead, he focused on execution, moving goods efficiently and following instructions precisely. This period laid the foundation for his later success. He learned how to operate quietly, how to avoid unnecessary attention, and how to build trust in environments where betrayal carried severe consequences. The Guadalajara cartel represented a turning point in Mexican organized crime. Its centralized operations, negotiated directly with Colombian suppliers, and established stable trafficking corridors into the United States. Guzmán entered this system at a time when scale mattered more than brutality. The organization needed individuals who could manage logistics, enforce discipline, and keep operations running without disruption. His role expanded steadily. By handling transportation and security, he gained access to higher levels of the organization. This exposure allowed him to understand how leadership functioned and how vulnerable it was to internal fractures. When Mexican authorities arrested key leaders, the cartel fractured into regional groups. This fragmentation created competition, but also opportunity. Guzmán aligned himself with figures from Sinaloa who shared routes, resources, and strategic goals. Rather than forming a rigid hierarchy, these groups operated through cooperation. This flexible structure made them harder to dismantle and allowed leaders to adapt quickly to pressure. This phase marked Guzmán's transition from participant to organizer. The Sinaloa cartel's strength came from decentralization. Independent cells operated semi-autonomously, reducing risk if one group was compromised. Guzmán's influence came from controlling access, routes, suppliers, and protection. Rather than issuing constant orders, he negotiated, incentivized, and mediated disputes. This approach reduced internal conflict and kept operations stable. It also allowed the cartel to expand internationally without relying on a single chain of command. Technological innovation played a role. Hidden compartments, underground tunnels, and sophisticated transport methods reduced seizure rates and increased efficiency. The organization's ability to adapt made it resilient. Arrests and losses slowed operations but rarely stopped them. Guzmán's 1993 arrest was the result of increased international pressure and intelligence sharing, particularly with U.S. agencies. Mexican authorities presented it as a major victory, signaling a renewed commitment to combating organized crime. Publicly, the arrest suggested that the state had regained control. Privately, the reality was more complicated. Guzmán was transferred between facilities and eventually placed in a high-security prison, but enforcement was inconsistent. Access to visitors remained frequent, and oversight was weak. Investigations later showed that bribery played a significant role in shaping his conditions of confinement. Rather than isolating him from his organization, prison became a controlled environment where risk was reduced. Decisions could be made without the constant threat of rival attacks. Trusted intermediaries carried instructions outward, maintaining operational continuity. This period demonstrated a recurring issue within the Mexican prison system. Incarceration did not necessarily equal removal of influence. Guzmán's case became an example of how corruption, rather than force, determined outcomes. His imprisonment slowed some activities but failed to disrupt the broader network. In 2001, Guzmán escaped from a maximum security prison, an event that shocked the public and embarrassed the Mexican government. The escape was later confirmed to have been facilitated by prison staff, revealing coordinated corruption rather than a security lapse. Investigations showed that Guzmán had received special treatment for months prior. Surveillance protocols were ignored, and movements within the facility were poorly monitored. The escape itself was simple in execution, but complex in planning. The incident had long-term consequences. It severely damaged public trust in law enforcement and demonstrated how deeply criminal influence had penetrated state institutions. International partners questioned Mexico's ability to contain high-profile offenders. For Guzmán, the escape restored operational freedom and reinforced his reputation. For the state, it became a symbol of institutional failure that would shape future policy debates. Following his escape, Guzmán adopted a highly controlled lifestyle. He moved frequently, avoided technology, and relied on a small circle of trusted associates. Communication was handled through couriers rather than electronic devices. During this period, violence across Mexico increased as rival organizations competed for territory. While Guzmán remained influential, he was not solely responsible for the broader escalation. Fragmentation among cartels played a significant role. Public narratives often portrayed him as omnipresent, but in reality, operations depended on decentralized leadership. Guzmán functioned as a coordinator rather than a constant decision-maker. These years demonstrated the adaptability of criminal networks. Despite increased enforcement efforts, operations continued through redundancy and flexibility. Guzmán's recapture in 2014 was widely celebrated. Authorities presented it as evidence of improved coordination and intelligence capabilities. However, optimism proved short-lived. In 2015, Guzmán escaped again, this time through an underground tunnel constructed from outside the prison. The tunnel was equipped with lighting, ventilation, and a rail system, indicating months of planning and significant financial investment. The escape highlighted ongoing vulnerabilities, particularly in infrastructure security and corruption prevention. While reforms followed, the event reinforced skepticism about long-term institutional reform. Guzmán's final arrest in 2016 marked a shift in strategy. Mexican authorities prioritized extradition to the United States, where prison conditions and legal oversight were stricter. The trial relied heavily on testimony from former associates, who described logistics, violence, and financial operations in detail. The proceedings offered a rare public look into the internal functioning of a major trafficking organization. In 2019, Guzmán was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 30 years. His transfer to ADX Florence effectively removed him from further influence. Guzmán's conviction did not end drug trafficking. Leadership structures adapted, and operations continued under new figures. His story illustrates a recurring pattern. Individuals can be removed, but systems persist. Poverty, demand, and corruption continue to create conditions where organized crime thrives. Understanding his rise helps explain why enforcement alone has limited impact without broader institutional change.